A day after the power grid collapse, the federal government has disclosed as part of its overall reform of the sector, the Transition Company of Nigeria, TCN, will be unbundled into two different entities. The government admitted that the TCN, which is responsible for managing the national power grid as well as delivering bulk electricity to distribution companies and eligible customers, have been identified as the weakest segment in the Nigerian electricity supply industry. Speaking in Abuja yesterday at the opening of the ministerial retreat organized by the Federal Ministry of Power, the Minister of Power Chief Adebayo Adelabu said TCN would be restructured to become the independent system operator and the transmission service provider. The three-day retreat has the theme, the Integrated National Electricity Policy and Strategic Implementation Plan, mitigating and ailing on the part of enhanced electricity reliability. He expressed regret over the second power grid collapse on Monday. Meanwhile, the Transmission Company of Nigeria yesterday also said that it had restored the national grid after it collapsed earlier on Monday. According to reports, the grid collapsed at about 1:49 p.m. on Monday. However, in a statement by General Manager Public Affairs, Mrs. Ndidi Umba, yesterday, he said that the CCN has restored the national grid and consequently light had been restored to most parts of the country except for the Jos houses, which will later be restored in 1 hour time after the release of that statement. Well, whether restored or not, the issue of the national grid is still a reflection of the sorry state of our power sector, which many feel is the reason we've not been able to truly attain that giant of African status, and which has aided our economic woes. But the big question on the big story for today is what can really be done to revitalize and revamp our electricity sector and help push our economic emancipation. Well, this and more is what this edition of the big story is all about. And we're talking about Nigerian electricity challenge and federal government plans to unbundle the TCN. That's what we'll be looking at as a major one. We'll still be looking at the challenges being dealt in our power sector, and we'll talk about electricity. And recent federal government plan, not all about unbundling the TCN, but also other interventions they seem to have done. Will it really change the narrative? It's a major question I'll be throwing to my guest. And also, I'll know you'll be having your reactions to it. But anyway, to join us this very first half of the discussion and also through the program, we have no other person but the DG Coalition to Transform Nigeria, Honorable Kovi Andrew Ikpetuku. Good morning and welcome to the show.
Yeah, good morning and thanks, viewers.
Well, anyway, let's just quickly go to it. Now, all of this is really more of a problem, especially as it concerns the power grid collapse on Monday again. And many will say it's becoming one too many. But I want also first start with that very retreat that is still ongoing in Abuja, organized by the Federal Ministry of Power. And that's the federal government plan to unbundle the TCN into two different entities. And on that note, I'm forced to ask a very simple and very straightforward question. Is the breaking up of TCN into two or more entities the problem we have? And would that in any way bring about proper solution, or rather proper investment into the sector, which the minister said is the weakest segment in Nigerian electricity supply, is needed at this time? Because why I ask, remember we broke down the PHCN into different sectors and we're where we are now. So is it all about breaking it down to different entities or having the right investment put into this sector that's considered the weakest among the electricity supply chain?
Yeah, thank you very much. One simple truth remains that, you see, the structure with which we run our agency,
yes,
is very worrisome. Many a times there is too much power committed to a particular agency. And looking at the vastness of the country, it becomes challenging for one particular agency to oversee the activities that runs the entire 36 states, including the Federal Capital Territory.
Okay.
You know, so I think that breaking down the TCN, the Transmission Company of Nigeria, into two is not a bad idea. It's actually a way forward to try to provide solution to the challenges that are on ground. But one thing that I feel is important is not just the breaking down. What are the responsibilities and the roles these agencies will now take up? And how do they know their diversities? Because many a times, by the time you break something down, you just realize that there is no difference because we are playing individual role as though they are still one. And at the end, they contradict each other's responsibility and making the situation worse. I think these are some of the things that has transpired over the past. You know, when PACN and all that were broken down, you know, people were working against each other because they feel everybody want to outshine the other. And you know, when you have such situation in any agency or in any nation, then you are bound to have conflicts. And once conflicts set in, then you see confusion everywhere.
So you feel breaking the TCN into two different entities would reduce the power that is so vested in the TCN alone and make it work? Because Nigerians would rather wish that the federal government should rather put more investment, more direction policy, more energy into having the TCN function as it should. Like I said, we've just had the TCN, we just had the national grid collapse just on Monday, day before yesterday, and only got restored some couple of hours after. And I've only just asked this, we've not gotten information whether it has fully come back on stream. We're still waiting for that very information, and when we get clarity, we'll let our viewers and the general public know. But let's still remain with it, because we've always had aspiration of making things work. The PHCN is a clear-cut example of breaking down a major power entity, like you said, into different fragments. But as it stands now, undermining some are doing pretty well, others are struggling behind. And the competitiveness we felt will bring about that breakdown, many will say it's not truly felt. So don't you feel the bureaucracy, the policy shift, the lack of implementation might come into these two different entities were finally created? Because that's where the problem lies.
The fact remains that, you know, when you have a project to split responsibility, automatically there is diversity.
Yes, of course.
And when there is diversity, you know, it brings about a kind of exposition. Instead of a particular individual taking responsibility for the entirety of activities in that agency, the responsibility is splitted. And now you are having more workforce, and they will be able to reach out based on assigned responsibilities. You know, so I still believe that it's a good step in the right direction. But while you do that, there are a lot of factors that must be put into consideration, and there are a lot of checks that must be set in place. Because a situation whereby responsibility are diverted, you know, there must be a checkup to ensure that these responsibilities that are placed in the hands of the different individuals are effectively carried out, and ensure that the dividends of those responsibilities are felt by the entire nation. Okay. So it is not just about the splitting. One, the right people who must take responsibility to ensure that these services are well provided must be put in place, because that is another area of challenge that I believe we have in this nation. Okay. A situation where a wrong person is given responsibility to handle a situation which he or she does not even have capacity
to do.
You know, to handle. And it has really dwindled a lot of achievement that we ought to have achieved as a nation. Looking at the issue of electricity, it is one pertinent area that is of great concern, not just only to Nigeria, but even to the foreigners coming to invest in Nigeria. Because the truth is that without electricity, industrialization is paralyzed. Apart from industrialization, even companies, agencies, they are kind of paralyzed.
Okay.
And as such, the government must do everything within his capacity to ensure that electricity is something or is an area that must be given fair priority in order to ensure there is sustainability of growth and development in the nation.
Okay, anyway, let's return to the issue of the Transmission Company of Nigeria and rather come to the issue of the collapsed national grid. It again reared its ugly head the second time this year on Monday, and it happened around 1:49 p.m. That's in the afternoon. And while we know the TCN, through its General Manager Public Affairs, Mrs. Ndidi Umba, has come out to say it has been resolved. But I'm forced to ask, why the frequency of the collapse? We only had one some couple of months back. Now we're having another. So what seems to be the problem there? We seem to have different problems as it concerns our electricity supply. Distribution seems not to be having it well. Gencos are the problem. Transmission seems to be also giving its reaction. But the biggest question is the national grid. Why the frequency in its collapse?
You see, there is a saying that when you concentrate too much energy in one particular direction, you are bound to collapse.
Of course.
The national grid, I believe, at this point, needs to be diversified.
Okay.
Because the workload centralized in a particular place is bound to experience unprecedented pressure on one side. Then secondly, the electricity generation is not even sufficient enough to service the 36 states of the Federation. So I think in the course of the retreat by the minister, I think there was a suggestion of breaking down the national grid into regional grid.
Okay.
And that is an excellent idea.
Okay.
Because at least it will help to assess generation processes regionally instead of nationally. So that if the different regions takes responsibility for their electricity generation, it will be easier to manage the responsibility
rather than coming from one central
rather than coming from the central. It will be regional. So even if there is an issue in a particular region, it doesn't necessarily have to affect other regions, because everybody will be taking responsibility to ensure that there is effective and efficient transmission of power. So I think that the issue of national grid should effectively become a thing of the past. That we should now be focusing on regional.
Okay.
And if possible, it can even be extended to states. Yes, if the need arises, because I believe it will be more effective and well managed when you break it down, so that everybody takes responsibility either for their region or for their state. So if you in your particular region or state is not effective or efficient enough in generating power or transmitting power, then it is your people that will be in darkness. It will no longer be
a national
issue that affects, because many a times excessive workload also affect the national grid. And some of these challenges could just be from a particular region or from a particular state that is creating this frequency that is affecting the national grid. If the whole thing is breaking down to region, it makes it effective to manage and also to assess and also to acknowledge where there are problems area. Once you are able to figure that out, it is easy. But when you still leave it at the national grid, then it becomes very challenging, because at the end of the day, before you even try to trace the root cause of problems and all that, it takes quite some time. And that's the reason why the national grid keep collapsing. Just this year, we have had it twice this year. And honestly, something has to be done to ensure that the regional or the state takes responsibility for their electricity generation.
Well, I'll need to thank you, but plead with you also to hold on. We need to go on a break now. And when we come back, I'll continue our discussion as we'll look at the recent idea coming from the federal government of unbundling the TCN. Many are saying, like you would say, that it seems to be the right move, especially at this time, looking at the constant collapse or the frequency in the collapse of the national grid. But others are also saying, would it not also lead to less administrative prayers and also less administrative push and also less administrative insight into how it is being run? And if taken into two different entities, we might necessarily see what happened to the PHCN in it being broken down into different segments and might at the end not get the required results. But anyway, let's go on the break and we'll come back and have more discussion on it.